Hello. So, as both an artist and an writer, I often have to describe or illustrate different kinds of outfits throughout the world and throughout the different time periods. And this book is really, really helpful because it starts from the Middle Ages or so and goes up to 1800 and shows a range of outfits and a range of different kinds of people wearing them, which helps you when you're trying to describe a scene or you're trying to add a character into a scene to know what they tended to wear. This is a Dover publication. I have many, many books from Dover. And one could say that their style can often be fairly flat, but that's okay for the purpose of what most people use these books for, which is more getting a sense of what kind of headwear they wore, what kind of weapons they tended to use in a given time period, what kinds of combinations of colors they tended to use. So these can be very helpful. If you have a scene that has religious medieval people, it has exactly what era each one is from. So one's from 1350, one's from 1450, or so on. So you can know, all right, they shouldn't wear this kind of hat yet because it would be too anachronistic for the story, but they need to wear this other kind of hat. Different kinds of monastic attire depending on what order they lived in. If you ever see Name of the Rose, that's a story and also a movie that has a number of different religious orders coming together to argue about their stance on different issues. And you can tell them apart in the movie and in the story by the way that they dress, because different orders had different rules for the types of things they were allowed to wear. Spain in the 13th century. And it also, in all of these cases, gives a sense of what the people themselves were like. If someone went around in full plate armor, then they would have a different view on life in general if they're going into battle than someone who went into battle with barely any cloth armor on. You just feel more vulnerable or less vulnerable or more of a target, and that people are going to be seeking you out. All of those kinds of things. So the clothing represents your station. It could be that this woman walking around in this kind of dress, this is an Italian Arthurian manuscript. So she might have been a poor person in court because she was missing furs or whatever else they tended to have. But if she's walking around town, she would be seen as a rich person because she had far better clothes than most of the other people. So it helps place yourself in society and how you would behave in different situations. French royalty and nobility. More French royalty and nobility. We tend to pick on the kinds of hats that they had, but back then, I'm sure they'd look at some of the things that we wear in modern times and think that they are outrageous. It's all about what other people are wearing and what you want to wear to stand out or to fit in, or all those kinds of things. You got some musicians. Got more French royalty and nobility. There's more pages in there. The different kinds of cloaks and sleeves and so on. And they have scenes of people getting married, people in church, people going about their business, lots of people heading off to war. So depending on what kind of scene you're hoping to portray, you can get information about the people and then also the people that they encounter along the way of what they're up to. Grave diggers. Get some ideas about the kinds of weapons they would use, kinds of activities they would do. Got money lenders of Antwerp. Got some Italian, different noblemen and officers. Gondoliers. A lot of times when they have, we'll say, TV miniseries or even movies, they are going for eye-catching things and not authentic things. So it's good to do some research and to try to figure out what people actually would have worn if you're trying to make something that is reasonably historically accurate. I always think of, there was a Pride and Prejudice version that came out right after Gone with the Wind, and they put all these Pride and Prejudice characters into Civil War attire with the big fluffy dresses, which is not at all what people in the Pride and Prejudice era would have been wearing. And it shaped the mindset of a whole bunch of people who watched this. Said, oh, well, clearly that's what people in England in the Pride and Prejudice era would have worn, but it was not. So it's good to take anything you see on TV and movies with a grain of salt. And I suppose even books, there's a number of books which are supposedly set in a historical time period and have wild anachronisms in them. Someone plays an instrument that didn't exist for like hundreds of years. So unless it's a time traveler kind of book, it's good to do your research and try to portray it as well as you can, because then you'll affect how other people either enjoy it, because if they know that something's anachronistic, they're going to be grumpy that it's not accurate. Or you could do it the other way. You could affect someone who doesn't know better and now says, oh, it's perfectly normal for there to have been, I don't know, guitars in the 1200s or whatever else could be incorrect. So back to the art of this. I just love all the costume details, and I suppose I could also say that if you're designing fantasy worlds or science fiction worlds, a lot of times you can look at these kinds of details and say, oh, it would be really neat if I had a world where everyone had big fluffy lace collars, but then they had form-fitting, I don't know, latex suits for the rest of their body, and it was the collar that really stood out. And, that was how it worked back then, not about the latex suits, but the lace, because lace was really expensive. It was hand-created, of course. So the more lace you had, and the more intricate the lace, the more money you had. So it was a very ostentatious show of wealth to say, oh, I can afford all this lace. You poor person, you can only afford one layer of lace. So something like this would really stand out as being extraordinary and eye-catching when someone came into the room. So lots of pretty lace details on these. More armor. I happen to love weaponry and armor, so I love those scenes. The intricate fabrics that they would have. And, we get so used in modern times to being able to get pretty much any kind of fabric we want, as long as you can pay for it, I suppose, because they just run off of machines. But back in these days, these fabrics were handmade, hand embroidered, hand woven, hand decorated. So something that had a lot of pattern on it would be very expensive because it represented hours and hours. I mean, something like this. Human beings had to embroider every one of those little things with high detail, and they would all have to be perfect on every layer, and they often had layer upon layer under them to stay warm. So a lot of money invested in that. All of the details in here. So I find these books to be extraordinarily helpful on a number of levels. We got all the different hats. Different dresses. So these are good just to have in your library to be able to refer to for not only when you're writing something set in a particular time frame, but also just to get inspiration. And, let's say that let's see if this is right. So these are the 1792 and 1786 French naval uniforms. So maybe you're not writing something in 1792. Maybe you're writing something in the 1800s. But this would have been the generation that the parents of the people that you're writing about would have worn, and what they think of as being the top of fashion. And then that would shape the way that the older generation in your books then refer to the younger people, say, oh, how could you possibly wear the see-through kind of fabric that you're wearing? People should be wearing things that are very structured and form-hiding, we'll say. So it helps to know the progression of fashion when you're developing your characters, because you're writing not only your main characters, but also the side characters. And the side characters have their own history of growing up through previous times. Some shawls in France up to the 1811 time period. So this is getting more into the Pride and Prejudice kind of stuff. Women's fashion of France from 1794 to 1800. Scotland. All these Scottish outfits. A little sweetie. Russia. Now I will comment that clearly this is very French and English, Europe-centric, with a few things about Russia and Poland. So you just have to know that when you get this book that it's about a particular topic, which is fine. You don't want a book that's 8 billion pages long that you can't deal with. You get different books on different time periods and different locations, and each one gives you information. So this one is Western costume, Middle Ages to 1800, very focused on France, some England, little tiny bits of Poland and Russia, but it gives you a good range of outfits and types of characters. You know, you could say more aimed towards nobility and the upper class. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about the characters and the scenes that you want to illustrate. Let me know if you have any questions.